Hi, everyone. I'm really pleased that you decided to join me to take a look at U.S. history. We try to take a look at U.S. history from a variety of different angles, try to identify the story behind the story. Sometimes we try to look at the odd things that have happened, and certainly examine the personalities that have made the American experience so unique in all the history of the world. In particular, we take a look at the U.S. Constitution, this wonderful document that has governed this country for well over 200 years. And we try to understand some of the complications and some of the problems that we face as a nation, day by day, year by year, month by month. In any event, I hope you're enjoying this and that you come back often because I will keep repeating these and posting them to YouTube so that you can relive the experience if you want to do it more than once. And I hope you do. Anyway, welcome and enjoy the presentations. Before we really get started, I have a favor to ask. If you would go down below and you would hit the subscribe and the like buttons, then that would give me an incentive to produce even more of these history programs just for you. Well, I'm happy to welcome you to another one of my history discussions, except today we're going to take a look at something that's more in the world of economics. And I hope I'm not going to bore most of you to death because it's not as exciting as the scandal of a president. But nevertheless, the history of money is very, very important. And so we're going to ask the question, where did it come from? Because it's very important in all of our lives, one way or the other. So we'll start by asking the fundamental question, what is money? We normally think of currency, and that's when we think of money. What is the dollar bill and the $10 and the $20 bill and so forth? Moreover, more generally speaking, money is any commodity which satisfies the following things. First of all, it has to be a unit of account. In other words, how do we keep track of things? And money is one of the ways we do that. It has to be a store of value. It has to be something that has real value or perceived value by everyone or anyone who wants to have it. And it has to be a medium of exchange so that we can go from one person to the other, exchanging money. Now, there are four types of early money. Things like tea, surprisingly, were and in some parts of the world can still be a commodity that's highly traded because there are specialized kinds of tea. Cheese, exotic cheeses, or even ordinary cheese has value and can be used as a commodity of exchange. And even at one time, spears were used as a way of using money, or what could be called money. In the colonial times in America, things like the beaver pelts and musket balls and the famous beads with which the Native Americans supposedly sold Manhattan, tobacco, especially in the middle colonies of Maryland, Virginia, and North Carolina, wampum on the part of the Native Americans, rice in South Carolina in colonial times, gold and silver always. Now, there are four main characteristics of money. First of all, it has to be portable. It has to be able to be moved from one place to the other so that you can exchange it. It has to be durable so that it doesn't disintegrate and disappear in front of you. And that's why diamonds and jewels and gold and silver become so valuable because they are durable. Has to have a divisibility. Can you divide it one way or the other? Because you don't always want whole units of everything. Sometimes you want a part of something. And limited availability, and that's why we attach so much importance to things like gold and silver and diamonds and other kinds of jewelry. Early commodity money, around 3000 BC, that's 5,000 plus years ago, commodities such as livestock and grain were used as money for many societies because they were the most valuable thing that anyone had at that time. The Chinese began to use cowries as money, these little shells. First of all, they were durable, they were convenient, they were divisible, and they were easily identifiable by anyone. Cowrie shells, furthermore, can withstand frequent handling and are small, and they're easy to transport. As they are nearly always the same shape and size, they could also be counted or simply weighed to determine the value of a payment. And there are different sizes of cowries, and so they would then acquire different value units based on that. Other things used in China 1,000 years ago were tool currencies because tools were very important in this period. Things that they made little miniature metal models of spades and hoes and blades and other things that they used in their normal lives. The first two coins that we can identify came to us about 561 BC. The Lydian King Croesus created the first true coin that history has recorded. One of the most famous historical characters of all times was Charlemagne, somebody who's worth studying if you want to take a little time into medieval history. And he standardized coins and monetary activity all throughout Europe from his reign around 800 AD. Chinese first used copper, and the first coin that we know about is something called the Banlang Quan. The Banlang coins, which turned up and began to circulate in that whole country as soon as China was unified, and that was in the Qin dynasty, 221 BC to 206 BC. It didn't last very long. Later, due to a severe copper shortage, the Chinese began issuing paper currency, but it didn't take them too long to discover that if they printed a lot of it, they would have fueled inflation. And so we have the first recorded history of inflation taking place. Tally stick. Ancient memory aids, they were a device used to record and document numbers, quantities, and various messages. The tally sticks first appeared as animal bones carved with notches in the Upper Paleolithic period, which is 50,000 to 12,000 years ago. Really, really a long time ago. And of course, you understand that when we go BC, we are counting from the oldest number to the lesser number. There is a historical reference to tallies made by Pliny the Elder just after the birth of Christ, AD 23 to 79, about the best wood to use for tallies, and of course later mentioned by Marco Polo, who mentions the use of the tally in China. About 1100 AD, the British began to use tally sticks. King Henry used the first ones that we know of, at least around 1100 AD. And that practice was going to last in England for over 700 years. Tally sticks are interesting because they can be divided, and then if you are not sure if yours matches with somebody else's, the fact that they were divided, usually you can physically see the match between them. In the 1600s, the goldsmith notes are accepted as evidence of ability to pay in the United Kingdom. These notes mark the first use of banknotes in England. In the New World, Americas, the colony of Massachusetts was the first colony to issue paper money in the United States. The first US dollar is this thing, which is called a continental. The Revolutionary War, Congress needed money, and so they began to print these things called continentals. But they quickly printed way too many of them, and they became oversupplied and therefore worthless. And may have another kind of inflation. Tobacco and wampum were accepted forms of currency in colonial America. Wampum is a traditional shell bead of the eastern woodland tribes of Native Americans. It includes white shell beads and hand-fashioned from the North Atlantic channeled whelk shell with white and purple beads made from the quahog, or western North Atlantic hard-shelled clam. States passed laws allowing individuals to print paper currency, which was then backed with local banks with gold and silver deposits. During the American Revolution, the continental dollars that I just mentioned a little bit ago were issued but without gold or silver backing, which made them virtually worthless by the end of the war. They're worth something as collectors today, but that's the only value they probably have ever really had. Specie. Specie means gold or silver coins, and that was what was more commonly used in the colonies because they were in limited supply and they had more value than paper money. When the nation began, the most plentiful coin in circulation was the Spanish peso. Benjamin Franklin and Alexander Hamilton differentiated the dollar system uh, from the pesos, which were on a basis of 8, by dividing the dollar into tenths rather than the pesos pieces of 8. And so you have a 10 base as versus an 8 base. First Bank of the United States in the U.S. was chartered for 20 years in 1789 by Alexander Hamilton. Well, 1789 means it went until about 1809. Took them a little bit of time to get a new bank chartered, but that was done in 1816. And its charter was going to go for another 20 years, and so it was going to go till 1836. And so it did. But then famously, one of the most famous actions in history is that Andrew Jackson, as president, in a personal feud with the man who was running the bank, he vetoed the continuation of the bank. And so what do we have in 1837? We have a massive depression in the United States. And of course, by then, Andrew Jackson is safely out of office and he's back in Nashville, Tennessee. And we have a free banking period that exists from 1837 to 1866. And during this period, virtually anyone could open a bank and issue notes. And many did. By 1860, it's estimated that up to 8,000 different notes were in circulation with varying degrees of backing. An estimated 60% of the banknotes were counterfeit. It would be easy to counterfeit, but privately issued banknotes. By 1811, the nation had about 100 state banks, which had a charter from their state governments. People could exchange paper notes for gold or silver. Each bank had its own currency design, so hundreds of different notes were in circulation. Counterfeiting became a serious problem because some currencies did not have gold or silver backing. Some merchants were wary to accept all forms of money. Then comes the Civil War. Civil War, all wars are expensive. The Civil War was no exception. So the Congress at that time, to finance the Civil War, authorized in 1861 the printing of 60 million of demand notes. They had no silver or gold backing, but the government declared them legal tender. By 1862, Congress authorized a new federal currency. Both of these currencies were called greenbacks because they were printed with green ink. So these greenbacks, the federal government issued greenbacks which were declared legal tender. The government says they're legal, they are legal if you accept them. The greenback standard. In time, people feared that greenbacks had little value, and like continental dollars, they began to avoid them. Congress then created a national banking system of national banks which were privately owned but chartered by the federal government. These banks issued national banknotes backed by the United States government bonds. State banks then withdrew their notes. Gold and silver certificates. In an effort to increase precious metal reserves, the government began issuing gold and silver certificates in 1863. And you should hope that you own one of these because as a collector, they're worth a great deal today. Silver certificates continued to be issued until the 1960s, when the price of silver jumped to $1.29 per ounce. Here are pictures of them. In 1863, the federal government issued gold certificates backed by gold in large denominations for banks to use between other banks as exchange. In 1886, it issued silver certificates backed by silver, of course, in the same way. 1863, Lincoln signed the National Banking Act, which created a dual banking system. We had national banks chartered and supervised by the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, the OCC, and it still exists today. They could issue national currency. State banks, controlled by the state regulatory agencies, which varied from state to state, restricted from issuing any national currency. Under the National Bank Act, notes were printed by the U.S. Treasury. National banks were required to purchase U.S. government bonds as banking for the notes. State bank notes were taxed at 10%, and because of that, they were soon driven out of circulation. Now, after the Civil War, there were five major currencies in use. There was the greenback, it was still there. There were national currency notes. There were gold certificates. There were silver certificates. And there were treasury coin notes. Then around the 1890s especially, we have strong arguments about bimetallism, shifting monetary system. The U.S. abandoned bimetallism for a greenback system during the Civil War, then returned to a gold standard without silver at all in 1873. This angered the silver advocates who blamed it for stifling inflation and prosperity. The crime of 73 and the Bannock of 1893, the civil rights called the 1873 Act a crime and saw it as a culprit in the severe 1893 depression. They argued for silver to increase the money supply and generate economic growth. And a big gold versus silver debate. The monetary debate pitted silver's potential for inflation and increased cash against the gold's perceived stability and ability to restore prosperity. Both sides had strong arguments, making it a central political issue. William Jennings Bryan is most famously associated with this controversy. He was a free silver champion. Bryan and several political parties, the Democrats, the Populists, the Silver Republicans, promoted bimetallism and free silver to combat economic hardship, opposing the Republican Party's pro-gold standard stance. Cross of Gold speech and defeat that Bryan gave. His fiery Cross of Gold speech galvanized his supporters, but ultimately his presidential effort fell short. Gold Rush and McKinley's win. The discovery of an efficient gold extraction method increased the gold supply, which of course was good luck for McKinley, ironically mirroring Bryan's inflation argument. McKinley's campaign effectively linked Bryan's platform to economic woes, contributing to McKinley's victory. And of course, when I say the gold rush, we're talking about the gold rush in Alaska in the late 1890s. Here's a random thought I wanted to throw in today. When I was teaching, my students invariably would ask, Dr. Liu, how long should my essay be? How long do I need to write this thing? Well, I always told them about Abraham Lincoln. When Abraham Lincoln was asked, how long do you think a man's legs should be? Abraham Lincoln famously replied, long enough to reach the ground. So the question that's related to this is, how much money do you need? The question's answer is, as much as you need to get the job done, and then you shouldn't need any more. Unfortunately, we have people in our world today who keep accumulating money when they really don't need it and will never have any use for it. So revising the bank system. The National Bank Act of 1863 strengthened the nation's financial system by creating a system of national banks. There were panics, though, actually there've been one back in 1837. I already mentioned that. There was one in 1857, and there were panics in 1873, a panic or a depression in 1893, and then another one in 1907. And people threw up their hands and said, how are we going to stop this? In the panic of 1907, J.P. Morgan alone, who was the wealthiest man probably in the world at that point, he stepped in with his personal fortune to shore up the U.S. government, and he saved the United States. But people said, well, we can't depend, there will always be a J.P. Morgan, can we? And so by 1907, the National Banking Act needed further reforms as the nation experienced financial crises and recessions. So, the Federal Reserve System was created in 1913 with Woodrow Wilson as the president. The role of the Fed is to control the supply of currency as well as regulate the banking system. And on the whole, it has done a good job throughout these last over 110 years, 11 years now. The Federal Reserve System. The Congress responded to the call for reform with the Federal Reserve System, or the Fed, the nation's first true central bank, a bank that lends to other banks in need. The Fed was set up like a corporation, however, and any bank that joined the system had to purchase shares of stock in the system. As a result, privately owned banks own the Fed, not the government. The Fed, however, is publicly controlled. While it's not a government, technically totally a government function, the president appoints and Congress approves the Fed's board of governors. Even though Congress created the Federal Reserve System, the Fed is financially independent of politicians and never has to go to Congress for money for its operations. Actually, the Fed pays its expenses with the interest income it makes when the U.S. Treasury pays the interest on the federal debt. And oddly enough, if the Fed earns more interest income than it needs to cover its expenses, it is required to turn over any unspent income to the U.S. Treasury as a, in quotes, donation, close quote, towards the federal debt. Monetary standards. A monetary standard is the mechanism designed to keep the money supply portable, durable, divisible, and limited in supply. It helps to keep the money supply sound so that the economy functions smoothly. It's a very complex thing to do, but by and large, it has been done. The United States has had several monetary standards in its history. Gold was losing its favor worldwide as a monetary standard by the early 1900s. By 1914, World War I broke out, and the United States and other nations were cut off from international trade. During such tenuous wartime conditions, gold lost most of its monetary importance. Nations no longer trusted shipping gold as payments for international debt. It stayed in the individual nation's vaults instead of generating economic activity. A monetary standard keeps the money supply portable, durable, divisible, and limited in supply. The United States has had several. The continental currency after the Revolutionary War was worthless, so Americans only trusted coins. The United States Constitution gave the federal government the power to coin money and prevented the states from doing so. Private banks produced paper money. Banks fulfill two distinct needs. They provide a safe place for people to deposit their money, and they lend excess funds to individuals and businesses temporarily in need of cash. This can only happen if the nation has a strong banking system. The gold standard. In 1900, Congress passed the Gold Standard Act, making the basic unit, the dollar, equivalent to a specific amount of gold. It did not change the use of greenbacks or notes, but Americans could exchange them for gold whenever they wanted. The advantages of a gold standard are: 1, the security Americans felt about their money, and 2, it prevents the government from printing too much paper currency because in order to print money, it needs to have gold backing it. The gold standard. The disadvantages of a gold standard are that the gold stock may not grow fast enough to support a growing economy. I mean, they're only mining so much gold in the world, and it has to be produced, or it has to be exchanged. People may decide to convert their paper to gold, draining the government's gold reserves. The price of gold will respond to the market and may lose substantial value. And the political risk of failure exists. The gold standard remained in effect until the Great Depression. Gold Act of 1934, the Gold Reserve Act. In order to deal with the banking crisis, FDR ordered U.S. citizens, as well as the Fed, to surrender all gold coins, bullion, and certificates to the U.S. Treasury in 1934. The Gold Reserve Act of 1934, ownership of gold by U.S. citizens was illegal until the act was repealed in 1974. So now you can own gold in this country. We need to mention the inconvertible fiat money standard. The inconvertible fiat money standard. Fiat money is government-issued money. that isn't backed by a physical commodity such as gold or silver. And so all of our money today are in convertible fiat money, one way or the other, in whatever denomination you might have. Since 1934, the United States has been on an inconvertible fiat money standard. I say sort of because there still was an element of gold reinforcing it until 1971. The money supply of the United States is managed by the federal government. Tangible components consist of coins and Federal Reserve notes. The intangible components include traveler's checks and checking and savings accounts. Modern money must also be portable, durable, divisible, and limited in supply. I have to mention the Bretton Woods system. The international monetary system after World War II was dubbed the Bretton Woods system after a meeting of 44 major countries in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in 1944. The countries agreed to keep their currencies fixed and adjustable except in exceptional situations to the dollar, and the dollar was fixed to gold. Since 1958, when the Bretton Woods system became operational, countries settled their international balances in dollars, and U.S. dollars were convertible to gold at a fixed exchange rate of $35 per ounce. The United States had the responsibility of keeping the price of gold fixed and had to adjust the supply of dollars to maintain the confidence in the gold's convertibility. Nixon closed the gold window. On August 15, 1971, Nixon closed the gold window and the U.S. dollar ceased to be convertible into gold. This marks the beginning of the current anchorless system that we have today. I have to mention the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Banks were overextended during the 1920s and many failed. Matter of fact, over 9,000 banks failed after the Great Depression hit in 1929. And I know, and somewhere in my files, I have records from 2 banks where my father lost all of the money he had on deposit. It wasn't a great amount of money, but for those times, it was a great difficulty he had to go through, and everyone did in the country. Banks did not have deposit insurance for their depositors, causing depositors rush on banks to withdraw funds. If you saw that the bank was in shaky condition, you would run to the bank and try to get your money out before the bank went bankrupt. As a result, many more banks failed. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation insured customers' deposits in the event of a bank failure. Credit unions. Birth of credit unions. They originated in Europe, reached the U.S. in 1908 as an alternative to predatory loan sharks and overlooked borrowers. There was a state-level adoption in the 1920s, culminating in the 1934 Federal Credit Union Act. Despite banking industry opposition, credit unions thrived, growing to over 6,400 by 1937 and exceeding 9,500 today with federal regulation by the NCUA. McFadden Act. 1927, the McFadden Act allowed national banks to branch within a state's limits to level the playing field with state-chartered banks. It prohibited interstate branch expansion for national banks. In 1994, the Regal-Neal Act repealed the McFadden's Act, and interstate branching restrictions now are gone, and they do go everywhere in the country. Savings and loans associations. Originally secured mortgages often fell on insurance companies with unfavorable terms for borrowers. Short-term loans with hefty balloon payments or interest-only options made the dream of owning a home elusive. In 1932, Congress established the Federal Home Loan Bank System, aiming at facilitating long-term amortized loans for home purchases. So, savings and loans. Affordable loans empowered the borrowers, offered convenient passbook accounts and certificates of deposit alongside longer-term mortgages. This gave borrowers more manageable options and paved the way for a generation of homeowners, which is beyond words that I could use to describe its importance. The impact of savings and loan associations on the American housing market is undeniable, it's massive, it's incredible, it's essential. Grip of the Depression. The world was gripped by the Great Depression with severe economic hardship. U.S. unemployment reached 25%, and the stock market plummeted by 36%. There were bank runs, people trying to get all their money out of the bank and with low reserves and added financial turmoil. By 1933, the U.S. banking system was on the brink of collapse with 9,000 banks that had failed. The public demanded action, and Roosevelt responded with an incredible number of bills to do things in the first 100 days. Congress passed the New Deal legislation, including measures to stabilize the banking system. Glass-Steagall Act was an important one in 1933. It separated commercial banking from investment banking, preventing risky practices that contributed to the Depression crisis. The FDIC was established, providing insurance for bank deposits and restoring public confidence in the financial system. Roosevelt famously denounced the money changers, who he believed had caused the crisis of the Great Depression. Powerful words signaled his commitment to reform and his determination to put the needs of ordinary Americans first. He did many revolutionary things. 1933, they passed the FDIC, ensuring deposits for up to $2,500 starting in 1934. Established the FDIC as a temporary government corporation. The FDIC's authority to provide deposit insurance to banks, regulated and supervised non-member banks, funded the FDIC to loans of $289 million, extended oversight to commercial banks, separated commercial and investment banking, prohibited banks from paying interest on checking accounts, allowed national banks to branch statewide. The FSLIC was created as part of the National Housing Act of 1932 in order to ensure deposits and savings and loans as well as banks. So then we have to mention the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform, Consumer Protection Act, the most sweeping change to financial regulation since the Great Depression. It reinstated distinctions between banks and hedge funds and limited banks' scope into them. It formed the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and Financial Services Oversight Council to monitor market conditions and gave the FDIC power to seize troubled banks deemed too big to fail. By the way, these are pictures of Senator Dodd and Barney Frank. Barney Frank is one of those people who's of great interest to us. He was one of the first openly gay members of Congress from Massachusetts. According to the Volcker rule, banks were also banned from investing for their own personal profit. In 2018, Trump signed into law the Economic Growth, Regulatory Relief, and Consumer Protection Act, which made some mild reforms to the Dodd-Frank Act. It raised the minimum amount of assets banks need to be subject to a more federal asset from $50 billion to $250 billion. And though gave power to the Fed to force them if necessary. The act also eliminated the Volcker rule along the way. Now, this is kind of a concluding thing that I thought was most interesting, because you wonder about the percent of U.S. financial assets. What institutional investor group has the most financial assets today, and which group has grown the most rapidly since 1980? Well, in the beginning, there were the pension funds in around 1970 that were at about less than maybe 5%, 3 or 4%, 10% of the people, but not very much anyway. And what happened was that over these recent years, they have grown to 30% are controlled by pension funds. So pension funds have assumed a great importance in our society and our financial management milieu. And so that becomes the end for today of a very complex subject. We're going to try to take a look at perhaps manifest destiny in a couple of weeks. The history of money is simply too complex to address in a short presentation like this. But I hope this gives you at least a little bit of a basis for understanding those things that are making such a huge difference in your life. Anyway, thank you for being my attendant an interested audience, and I look forward to my next interaction with you. Have a wonderful January and February and March and all of 2024. Take care and thank you. When I started my presentation, I told you that I would really appreciate it if you would hit the subscribe and the like buttons down below, because that gives me an incentive to produce more programs just for you.